So,
Thank you, Margie. Is this switched on? Yeah.
yes.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I guess to start with, I just want to explain a little bit about the origins of the project, because Sorcia and I have been thinking about this for a long, long time. I guess for myself, I started thinking about it when I was working on a project at ODI here on situations, when livelihoods in situations of political instability, where I realized that, from a livelihoods perspective, we often talk about vulnerability in economic terms, but we don't really analyze or kind of address political vulnerability. And I was thinking that maybe protection, linking with protection, might be able to help. And then when I was working in Oxfam and covering in particular Darfur, I was reading, when reading through the reports of kind of protection specialists, I was kind of thinking, but that's the kind of issues that I would also be looking at from a livelihoods perspective. For example, issues of manipulation or exclusion from food distribution, issues relating to return, and also, of course, as many of you will know, issues relating to attack and rape associated with collection of firewood. At the same time, Sorcia here was working on a project, an ODI HPG project on protection in practice, which also raised similar kind of livelihoods issues. So we decided to come together and do a joint project. So what we've tried to do in the research project, of which we are presenting the findings now, is we look at, first of all, the links between threats to protection and to livelihoods. And I guess, it's at the most basic level, it seems so obvious that risks to protection and livelihoods are linked. For example, it's clear that risks to livelihoods are a consequence of violence and human rights abuse, particularly in situations of conflict, and that loss of livelihoods will also lead or will increase people's exposure to threats. But we felt it would be beneficial to look in more detail not only at the links between threats, but also how people respond and balance the risk that they are faced with. We then also looked at agency responses and to see whether increased linkages between protection analysis and livelihoods analysis and programming could lead to a greater impact. So really the overall aim of the study was to understand whether and how greater complementarity between livelihoods and protection analysis and action can more effectively reduce the risk that conflict-affected populations face. I guess I should also say that, there's been lots of studies before on livelihoods in conflict, on protection in conflict, but what we think is different about this study is that we've tried to look equally at protection and livelihoods. So Sorcia here was looking at the protection side and I was looking at the livelihood side. So we really tried to give equal emphasis to both. And the other thing is looking more at the programmatic response options. So we actually started working together on this in 2007, and when we did a literature review, but we did case studies in Darfur, Sri Lanka, Chechnya, and the Palestinian territories, with the case studies in Darfur, Sri Lanka, and Chechnya, all very closely linked to the programs of the Danish Refugee Council. Very briefly on methods, what we did was within each of the case studies, we identified different livelihood groups which faced similar protection threats, but who might be affected differently by those threats. So, for example, in Darfur, we looked at farmers who were faced with destruction, loss or theft of assets, but increasingly kind of limited freedom of movement and ongoing risk to safety. We also, within the same area, looked at Arab groups who were also affected by limitations on movement. And now there's increased inter-Arab conflict, so also risk to safety. IDPs in camps mainly kind of affected both by risk to safety when carrying out their livelihood strategies, and also incursions by the army or militia groups. And I mean, similarly, in the Palestinian territories, we looked at farmers affected by the barrier, so who were cut off from their land because of that. We looked at Palestinians living in Hebron, who were affected by Israeli settler violence, and people living in camps affected by incursions by the Israeli Defense Force. We also looked at Bedouin populations who were, I guess, faced with a combination of all of those threats. Then, on the basis of literature review, secondary information, discussion with agencies, we tried to identify key protection threats or key protection concerns that also presented risk to livelihoods. So, for example, in Darfur, we looked mainly at physical safety, freedom of movement, access to basic services, whereas in Palestinian territories, we also looked at freedom of movement and safety, but more to we looked at issues of access to land and property. So in terms of how we analyzed risks, we took this model, which is given in one of the main kind of protection manuals, but in fact based on kind of natural disasters. I guess mainly what this shows is that we looked at risk as a combination of the threats that people face, their vulnerability, and the capacity or the choice that people have in responding. So what I'm going to do now is talk in more detail about the threats, vulnerability, and people's response strategies. Again, a lot of this, I mean, I think it's useful to just kind of go over these, but I'm sure many of these are very obvious. So, for example, one of the main threats has been kind of, in all case studies, is violence, either direct attacks on villages or destruction and looting, but also indirect through decimation of services, loss of access to employment, land, and markets. And in fact, forced displacement was a key feature, I guess, in each of the case studies that we worked in. But, I mean, violence also included things like, I've already mentioned issues of rape in Darfur, arrest, detention, disappearances in Sri Lanka, Chechnya, and Palestinian territories. And clearly, these have impacts on livelihoods just because either you lose your livelihood completely or access to land or markets or employment is limited. And people would often, I mean, because of risk, violence, people would often also restrict their movement. So the restricted freedom of movement in all case studies was in some ways a result of insecurity and violence, but in many cases there was also a much more deliberate restriction of movement. Now, for example, in Darfur, I mean, there are actually now increasingly number of checkpoints and informal taxes which stop people or make it more expensive to move from one place to another. But also, I guess when you talk about in Sri Lanka and Palestinian territories, it is a much more kind of, I guess, sophisticated control of movement with, a large number of permits needed to move from one place to another or even within the area. And this is also affects not only not only affects movement of people, but also movement of goods. So it has a great sort of economic impact on, say, for example, the West Bank or at the time, the northern areas of Sri Lanka. I should have said that we did this case study before the most recent events in Sri Lanka. Land and property rights, in terms of the deliberate denial of land rights and in many cases to encourage abandonment or displacement, was a feature in all case studies. So, for example, we talked about we found issues of secondary occupation of land in Darfur and Sri Lanka, and I've already mentioned issues relating to the West Bank in Palestinian territories where farmers were cut off from their land. So again, this has obvious impacts on livelihoods. And then finally, we found particularly in Sri Lanka and Chechnya that the loss or theft of personal documentation was a key protection threat, which also had impact on livelihoods, just because, again, it limits people's ability to move to their farms, to their markets. And all of this clearly leads to a restriction in the livelihoods options that people have. So in terms of vulnerability, we probably didn't give such a great emphasis on vulnerability when we started doing this study. But then when we had a workshop in July last year with some of the key people who'd been involved in this study, it came out as a key issue both for livelihoods and protection actors. But that each of from the livelihoods and the protection side, we tend to look at these things differently. So, for example, from the livelihood side, we might look at livelihoods groups and wealth groups. From the protection side, maybe at IDPs, particular ethnic groups, female-headed households. So what we try to do is find a way of bringing the two together, in a way that makes sense. So what we did in the end is looked at causes of vulnerability, in relation to protection threats, policies and institutions and processes from both perspective, assets and identity. So, for example, all the protection threats that I've just mentioned are causes of vulnerability. But these threats are usually part of wider policies of oppression. So, for example, the restrictions on movement that I was just talking about are deliberate policies on the part of the Israeli government and Sri Lankan government. But it doesn't need to necessarily be higher level policies. It can also be local level action, like, for example, informal taxation, checkpoints, or extortion, coercion for protection arrangements. And similarly, in terms of when we look at sort of policies and institutions, I mean, the reach and accountability of many of the institutions that are relevant both to livelihoods and protection are key in determining the vulnerability of certain groups. So you might be talking about civil, economic, judicial, political institutions. And in all four of the case studies, we find they were characterized by inadequate rule of law, failed justice systems, widespread impunity, and corruption. So both the protection threats and the policies institutions are key determinants of vulnerability, but also where people live, what they own, who they are. So, for example, in Darfur, in Palestinian territories, in Sri Lanka, where people lived, especially when they lived in resource-rich areas, that opened them up to attack and exploitation and coercion. So I've already said, I mean, as a consequence of that, people's response options become very limited. And what we then looked at as the strategies that people use to kind of meet their livelihood, to meet their basic needs, but also to keep safe. And what we found is that, people need to balance very carefully the risks to their livelihoods and their safety. I know this is a very busy slide, but this focused mainly on community strategies, so the strategies that people will use to balance the risks to their livelihoods and their protection. And what we found is you can group them according to whether they're avoiding the threat, reducing exposure, confronting the threat, or in fact, having no choice but to remain exposed to the threat. So just some examples. When you talk about sort of at situations where people maybe have more choice, they can either they can avoid the threat by either changing their patterns of movement, by temporarily displacing themselves, or if they have forewarning, they can take some assets with them when they move. So clearly, in this case, the risk to safety are minimized, and livelihoods are retained to some extent. But as you go down the page, if you like, the degree of choice that people have decreases, and the severity of risk that people face increases. So, when we talk about reducing exposure to threat, there were a number of strategies that people could use. For example, they could spread the risk by splitting families, by traveling in groups to carry out livelihoods activities. And again, this maintains some livelihoods asset strategies, and it reduces physical danger. But as you go down, you might find that one of the few options open to people is to form alliances with power holders in terms of, paying protection money, establishing links, and that this can reduce danger and short-term risks. And it might have short-term risks, but in terms of livelihoods assets, people might retain their access to land. And this was particularly an example in Darfur. You get to the more extreme examples, either the risk to protection or the risk to safety or the risk to livelihoods becomes more extreme. So we found, for examples in Palestinian territories in particular, where people chose to resistance or to confront the threat. And this can be either active or passive in terms of just refusing to move. Now this, of course, in some ways does kind of allow you to maintain some livelihoods assets, your land again, but it does put you at high risk of danger. And again, as choice decreases, some people have no option but to, continue to farm or collect firewood or whatever in unsafe areas. So really, what we think this model can do is allow you to determine the severity of risk that people face in terms of both risk to livelihoods and protection, and maybe look at ways in which or look at the possibilities of increasing people's choice and therefore minimizing the risk. But Sorcha is going to talk more about the programmatic side of things. So finally, I just wanted to give an example of how this model would work in a particular place that we went to, which is a village in eastern West Darfur, where you had an ethnically mixed group of people living together, with mainly four farmers living in a settled village, and Arab, also mostly settled Arab pastoralists living in what we call damras, or settlements around it. So the main threats that, and I guess I'm talking mainly from the Fur perspective here, the main threats that they faced were issues of physical safety, coercion, in that they paid protection or payments. So they paid for protection by Arab groups, and also limited freedom of movement. So their responses included traveling in groups to markets, splitting off families to, live, splitting off families, I guess both to where you would find one person living in the main, still at home, another in a camp, another in a different camp, and maybe another in Khartoum or overseas. Another strategy was to reduce cultivation, or rather to reduce the area that people planted. But I guess the main determinant of physical safety for those particular villages was the type of protection arrangement that they were able to make with the surrounding Arab groups. And in some, the arrangements varied. In some it was more kind of a regular payment. In others it was kind of payment to leave the village to visit markets. And I just want to say, I've recently been to Darfur, back to Darfur again, and there I found these arrangements still exist, but there's a new kind of arrangement where IDPs were also making arrangements with people who are currently occupying and farming their land. So that could be either they would farm a part of their land or share a portion of the harvest with people actually occupying their land right now. And when I was talking about this with my colleagues, I was saying, yes, but it's you have to be very careful if you want to support those kinds of arrangements. There might be very unequal power relations that you have to be careful of, etc. And but what they came back with and said, well, even if it is an exploitative relationship, there might be good reasons for both sides why this is happening. And on the kind of the farmer side, it was really in terms of having been away from their land for so long, having to or feeling that they wanted to maintain their right to that land, but also didn't want to lose their identity as because their identity was so closely related with farming and access to land. And on the other side, on the occupiers' Arab side, I'm sure Helen will have lots of things to say about this, but there's a need to kind of rebuild positive relationships between the two groups. So kind of also, I guess, a recognition that the peace process was moving too slowly to actually, and having to kind of build alliances without external intervention. So these are just some of the examples, I guess, of the difficult choices that people have to make when they are in very difficult and protracted conflict situations. So now Sorcia is going to take about